The thundering of hooves echoed across the dusty plains as Isaac Caldwell rode into Redemption Creek, a man with shadows beneath his eyes and a past that haunted his every step. The year was 1875, and the once bustling mining town had withered like summer grass in the relentless heat of the Arizona Territory. At 32, Isaac had spent more years riding alone than he cared to remember, his only companions the whispers of the wind and the reliable weight of his Colt revolver at his hip. The auction hadn't been his destination when he'd set out that morning. He'd meant to stock up on supplies and perhaps indulge in a whiskey before heading back to his modest ranch 15 miles outside of town. But the commotion in the town square drew him like a moth to flame, his curiosity piqued by the unusual gathering. "Next up," bellowed the auctioneer, a portly man with sweat stains darkening his shirt, "we got ourselves a woman. Can't tell you much about her looks, but she's young and strong. Previous owner says she's good with a needle and knows her way around a kitchen." He gestured to a slight figure standing on the makeshift platform, a burlap sack covering her head and upper body, her hands bound before her. Isaac's jaw tightened. Slave trading had been outlawed a decade ago, but in territories like this, far from federal oversight, such practices continued under the thin disguise of indentured servitude. He'd seen enough injustice in his years to recognize it plainly before him. "Starting bid at $20, the auctioneer called, his voice carrying across the square. A few men raised their hands, their intentions clear in their leering gazes. Isaac found his hand lifting almost of its own accord, a strange compulsion driving him. "25, he called out, his voice gruff from disuse. The bidding continued, each raise tightening the knot in Isaac's stomach. When the price reached $50, nearly all the money he had intended for supplies, Isaac made his final bid. To his relief, the other interested parties dropped out, likely deeming the mysterious woman too costly a gamble. "Sold to the gentleman in the brown hat," the auctioneer announced, pointing to Isaac. Moments later, Isaac found himself leading the woman by a rope tied to her bound wrists, her movements hesitant and stiff as she stumbled alongside his horse. The sack remained in place, her identity a mystery beneath the rough burlap. He could hear her labored breathing through the fabric, could sense her fear in the trembling of her hands. Once they were clear of town, Isaac stopped his horse and dismounted. Gently, he helped the woman sit on a fallen log beside the trail. "I'm going to untie your hands now," he said, keeping his voice low and steady. "I mean you no harm." The woman remained silent as he worked at the knots binding her wrists. When they finally came free, revealing raw, reddened skin beneath, she rubbed them slowly but made no move to remove the sack. "You can take that off," Isaac said, gesturing to the burlap covering before realizing she couldn't see his motion. "The sack, I mean, you're free to remove it." Slowly, tentatively, her hands rose to the rough material. She pulled it upward, revealing first a delicate chin, then full lips pressed into a tight line, a straight nose, and finally eyes deep, expressive eyes the color of summer sage that widened as they fell upon his face. "Isaac," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Isaac Caldwell, the blood in his veins turned to ice. He stared at the woman before him, a stranger, yet somehow familiar, her copper hair falling in tangled waves around a face he could not place in his memories. "How do you know my name?" he demanded, his hand instinctively moving toward his gun, the woman's eyes filled with tears. "It's me," she said, her voice breaking. Grace Redmond." The name hit him like a physical blow. Memories cascaded through his mind, a young girl with fiery hair running alongside him through golden wheat fields, secret meetings by the creek behind her father's property, whispered promises under a blanket of stars. Grace Redmond, the daughter of the wealthiest rancher in his hometown of Pine Ridge, Colorado. The girl he'd loved with all the fierce devotion of his 18-year-old heart before her father had driven him away at gunpoint, threatening to kill him if he ever came near his daughter again. Grace. He repeated, disbelief coloring his voice. "It can't be. How? It's a long story," she said, her gaze dropping to her hands, "one I'm not sure I have the strength to tell just yet." Isaac nodded slowly, still struggling to reconcile the refined young woman of his memories with the bedraggled figure before him. "My ranch isn't far," he said. "You can rest there, get cleaned up. Tell me when you're ready." The ride to Isaac's homestead passed in silence, Grace seated behind him on his horse, her arms tentatively wrapped around his waist. Each mile that passed brought a fresh wave of questions to his mind, but he held them back, sensing her exhaustion. His ranch was modest, a small cabin with a barn and corral, a vegetable garden, and a chicken coop, but it was his, built with his own hands over the past 5 years. As they approached, he felt a strange mix of pride and self-consciousness. What would she think of his simple life after the luxury she'd known inside the cabin? Isaac busied himself heating water for a bath while Grace sat at his rough-hewn table, her fingers tracing the wood grain. "You built this place yourself," she said. "It wasn't a question." Isaac nodded. "Every nail and board. It suits you," she offered, the ghost of a smile touching her lips. "You always said you wanted a place of your own, somewhere quiet where you could see the stars." The fact that she remembered such a detail after 14 years struck him deeply. He turned away, blinking rapidly. When the bath was ready, he showed her to the small side room where he'd placed the tub, leaving her with soap, towels, and a clean shirt of his that would serve as a nightgown. "Take your time," he said. "I'll fix us something to eat." While Grace bathed, Isaac prepared a simple meal of beans, bacon, and cornbread. His mind whirled with questions. How had Grace Redmond, daughter of one of the wealthiest men in Colorado, ended up at a slave auction in Arizona territory with a sack over her head? What had happened in the years since he'd last seen her? And why did his heart still leap at the sound of her voice, as though he were still that love-struck boy of 18? When she emerged from the bathing room, her hair damp and his shirt hanging loosely on her slender frame, Isaac nearly dropped the plate he was holding. Even after whatever hardships had brought her to this point, Grace possessed a quiet dignity that transformed his humble cabin by her mere presence. They ate in relative silence, both stealing glances when they thought the other wasn't looking. Finally, as Isaac cleared away the dishes, Grace spoke. "I suppose you're wondering how I ended up at that auction block." Isaac sat across from her, his expression carefully neutral. "Only if you want to tell me." Grace took a deep breath, her fingers nervously twisting a strand of her copper hair. "After you left, after my father drove you away, I was heartbroken. I refused to eat, barely slept. Father decided what I needed was a husband to set me straight." Her lips twisted in a bitter smile. "He arranged a marriage to Harold Tanner, a business associate twice my age." Isaac's hands clenched into fists beneath the table, but he remained silent. "I refused at first, but Father threatened to have our ranch hand, Miguel, the one who used to help us meet in secret, arrested on false charges if I didn't comply. So I married Harold." She paused, her gaze distant. "He was cruel, not at first. At first he was all politeness and proper behavior. But once we were married and living at his ranch in New Mexico territory, his true nature emerged." She pulled up the sleeve of Isaac's shirt, revealing a jagged scar that ran from her elbow to her wrist. "That was from the time I served his dinner too cold. There were other punishments too, ones that left no visible scars." Isaac felt sick with rage, his vision blurring at the edges. "Grace, she held up a hand. "Please let me finish. I need to say this all at once." He nodded, forcing himself to listen without interruption. "Last year, Harold died thrown from his horse while drunk. I thought I was finally free, but his brother Curtis appeared at the funeral and informed me that Harold had gambled away everything. The ranch, the livestock, even the furniture. It all belonged to Curtis now, including me as Harold's property." She spat the word. Curtis was worse than Harold. Where Harold had been calculating in his cruelty, Curtis was impulsive, unpredictable. 3 weeks ago, he lost badly at cards. To settle his debt, he sold me to the man who put me on that auction block." Isaac rose from the table, unable to contain his anger any longer. He paced the small confines of the cabin, his breathing ragged. "If either of them were still alive, I'd kill them with my bare hands," he growled. "That's why I never tried to find you," Grace said softly. "I was afraid of what might happen if you knew." Isaac stopped pacing, turning to face her. "You thought about finding me," a flush crept up her neck. every day for 14 years. The admission hung in the air between them, charged with unspoken emotion. When they put that sack over my head this morning, I prayed for the first time in years, Grace continued. Not for rescue, I'd given up on that, but for a quick end. When you bought me, I had no idea who you were. But then I heard your voice, telling me I could remove the sack. Her eyes met his, filled with wonder. It was like God had finally answered every prayer I'd ever whispered. Isaac crossed the room in 2 strides, kneeling before her. Cautiously, he took her hands in his, careful of her raw wrists. I never stopped loving you, he confessed, his voice rough with emotion. I tried, God knows I tried, but not a day went by that I didn't think of you, Grace's eyes filled with tears. I never stopped loving you either, she whispered. Isaac wanted nothing more than to take her in his arms, but he held back, aware of all she had suffered. You're safe now, he said instead. You can stay here as long as you need, no obligations. When you're ready, I'll help you get wherever you want to go. Grace squeezed his hands. Thank you, she said simply. That night, Isaac made a bed for himself on the floor, insisting Grace take his bed. As he lay in the darkness, listening to her steady breathing, he marveled at the twist of fate that had brought her back into his life. He promised himself that, whatever happened next, he would protect her with everything he had. Dawn broke with a painter's touch across the eastern sky, rousing Isaac from a fitful sleep. He found Grace already awake, standing on his small porch, watching the sunrise with a tranquil expression he hadn't seen the day before. I'd forgotten how beautiful mornings could be, she said as he joined her. Harold and Curtis both preferred to sleep until noon. The morning was my only time of peace. Isaac nodded, understanding. Coffee, he offered, please. As they sipped the strong brew, Isaac outlined his plans for the day chores that needed tending, a fence that required mending. You're welcome to rest, he added quickly. After everything you've been through, I'd like to help, Grace interrupted. I need to feel useful. Isaac hesitated, but the determination in her eyes convinced him. All right, he agreed, but promise you'll rest if you get tired. The day passed in companionable labor. Isaac marveled at Grace's resilience as she helped collect eggs, weed the garden, and prepare meals. Despite years of abuse, her spirit remained unbroken, bent perhaps, but never shattered. As evening approached, they sat together on the porch, watching the sunset paint the desert landscape in hues of gold and crimson. I never thought I'd see you again, Isaac said, breaking the comfortable silence. When your father ran me off, I headed west without any real plan. Worked as a ranch hand, tried my luck in the gold fields, even rode with a cattle drive up to Montana. Nothing felt right until I found this place. Grace listened intently, her eyes never leaving his face. And have you been alone all this time? She asked, a hint of hesitation in her voice. Isaac understood the question beneath her words. There have been women, he admitted honestly. None that mattered, none that were you. A soft blush colored her cheeks, visible even in the fading light. And now, she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. What happens now? Isaac turned to face her fully. That depends on what you want, Grace. You're not beholden to me because I bought you from that auction. You're free to go wherever you please, whenever you're ready. Grace was quiet for a long moment, her gaze drifting to the distant mountains. What if I want to stay? She finally asked. Isaac's heart thundered in his chest. Then you'd make me the happiest man in the Arizona territory, he said simply. The following weeks settled into a rhythm as spring blossomed across the desert. Grace's presence transformed Isaac's solitary existence in ways both profound and subtle. The cabin, once merely a place to sleep, became a home filled with small touches, wildflowers in a jar on the table, curtains fashioned from flour sacks, the lingering scent of baking bread. They circled each other cautiously at first, both aware of the fragility of their reconnection. Isaac was careful never to raise his voice or make sudden movements that might startle her. Grace gradually stopped flinching when he entered a room unexpectedly. Trust, once broken, was slowly being rebuilt between them. One evening in late April, as they sat by the fire after supper, Grace asked a question that had clearly been weighing on her mind. Did you ever try to contact me after you left Pine Ridge? Isaac set down the piece of harness he'd been mending. Once, he admitted. About a year after I left. I sent a letter to Miguel, asking him to pass it to you secretly. Grace's eyes widened. I never received any letter. I figured as much when there was no reply. Your father must have intercepted it. What did it say? She asked, leaning forward. Isaac's gaze dropped to his hands. That I was working on a ranch near Santa Fe. That I was saving every penny to buy a place of my own someday. That I still loved you and would come back for you when I had something to offer besides an empty pocket and big dreams. Grace's eyes glistened with unshed tears. I would have come to you, she whispered. If I'd known where to find you, I would have run away in a heartbeat. Isaac crossed the room to kneel beside her chair, taking her hands in his. We can't change the past, he said gently, but we're here now, together, that's what matters. Grace nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek. Isaac reached up to brush it away, his touch feather-light against her skin. Their eyes met, and the years between them seemed to vanish like morning mist under the desert sun. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, Isaac leaned forward. His lips met hers in a kiss as gentle as a whisper, a question rather than a demand. Grace answered by winding her arms around his neck, drawing him closer as the kiss deepened into something hungry and healing all at once. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Isaac rested his forehead against hers. I've waited 14 years to do that again, he murmured. Grace smiled, the first true, uninhibited smile he'd seen since her arrival. It was worth the wait, she replied. As spring gave way to summer, their relationship blossomed alongside the desert wildflowers. Isaac expanded the garden, building a small irrigation system from the nearby creek. Grace took up sewing again, creating practical garments that soon replaced the borrowed clothes she'd been wearing. They spoke often of the past, filling in the gaps of their separated lives. Isaac told her about his travels, the odd jobs and adventures that had eventually led him to Redemption Creek. Grace shared happier memories of her youth after his departure, her friendship with Miguel's sister, her love of painting, which Harold had forbidden early in their marriage. Neither spoke of the future explicitly, content to let each day unfold naturally. But Isaac found himself planning nonetheless, setting aside extra money when he sold his horses, thinking of ways to expand the cabin to make it more comfortable for two. In late June, their peaceful existence was interrupted by an unexpected visitor. Isaac was repairing the corral when he spotted a rider approaching, dust billowing behind the horse. He instinctively reached for his rifle, calling for Grace to stay inside. As the rider drew closer, Isaac recognized the sheriff from Redemption Creek, a fair-minded man named Sullivan with whom he'd had limited but cordial interactions. Caldwell, Sullivan greeted, tipping his hat as he dismounted. Been a while since you've come to town. Been busy with the ranch, Isaac replied cautiously. What brings you out this way, Sheriff? Sullivan's gaze drifted to the cabin where Grace stood in the doorway despite Isaac's warning. Got word about a woman, he said. Red-headed lady you bought at auction back in March. Fellow came through town looking for her, says she's his property, claims she was stolen from him. Isaac's jaw tightened. That would be Curtis Tanner, I expect, and she's not property, she's my wife. The lie slipped out smoothly, a protective instinct. From the corner of his eye, he saw Grace's surprised expression. Sullivan studied him for a long moment. That right, don't recall performing any ceremonies lately. We were married back in Colorado years ago, Isaac improvised. Got separated, found each other again by chance. That's quite a coincidence, Sullivan remarked, skepticism evident in his tone. God works in mysterious ways, Isaac replied evenly. Would you like to see our marriage certificate? It was a gamble. He had no such document, but he doubted the sheriff had ridden all this way expecting to examine paperwork. Sullivan sighed, removing his hat to wipe sweat from his brow. Look, Caldwell, I don't much care about the personal affairs of folks who keep to themselves and cause no trouble. But this Tanner fellow's offering a substantial reward for information. He's staying at the hotel in town, and he's hired 3 men who look like they make their living with their guns. Isaac nodded, understanding the unspoken warning. I appreciate you riding out to tell me, Sheriff. Just be careful, Sullivan said, remounting his horse. And maybe consider taking a trip for a while. I hear New Mexico's nice this time of year. After the sheriff departed, Isaac quickly began preparations. "We need to leave," he told Grace, who had joined him in the barn. "Tanner won't stop looking, and I won't risk him finding you." "This is your home," Grace protested. "You built it with your own hands." "I can't ask you to abandon it because of me." Isaac paused in his packing to face her. "Grace, listen to me. This place, the land, the cabin, it's just wood and dirt. You're what matters. You're home to me." Her eyes welled with tears. "You called me your wife," she said softly. Isaac's movements stilled. "I know it was presumptuous." "No," she interrupted. "It felt right. Hearing you say it felt like the most natural thing in the world." Their gazes locked, the air between them charged with unspoken possibility. "If we're leaving," Grace said, a newfound determination straightening her spine, "let's make it true before we go." Isaac's breath caught. "Are you saying, 'Ask me properly, Isaac Caldwell'?" she challenged, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Without hesitation, Isaac dropped to one knee, taking her hands in his. "Grace Redmond, I've loved you since I was 18 years old. Will you marry me today before we ride out of here together?" "Yes," she answered without hesitation. 1,000 times yes. Within the hour, they stood before the fireplace in Isaac's cabin, exchanging vows with no witnesses but God and each other. Isaac placed his mother's ring, the only heirloom he possessed, on Grace's finger. Though there was no minister to pronounce them husband and wife, the promises they made were as binding as any legal ceremony. By nightfall, they were miles from the ranch, heading north with only what they could carry on 2 horses. Grace rode the gentle mare Isaac had been training to sell, her copper hair hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. They traveled mainly at night, resting during the heat of the day in whatever shelter they could find. 3 days into their journey, as they made camp in a sheltered canyon, Isaac noticed Grace staring pensively into the small fire. "Having regrets?" he asked quietly, the fear that had haunted him since their departure finally finding voice. Grace looked up, startled. "About marrying you, never." She moved to sit beside him, resting her head on his shoulder. "I was just thinking about how strange life is. If Curtis hadn't sold me, if you hadn't been in town that day, if you hadn't recognized my voice." "Too many ifs to count," Isaac agreed, wrapping an arm around her. "But here we are, despite it all." "Where are we going?" she asked, the question she'd refrained from asking until now. "I have a friend in Colorado, not near Pine Ridge," he added quickly. "He owns a horse ranch near Denver. Offered me a job managing it a few years back, but I wasn't ready to leave my place then. And now," Isaac pressed a kiss to her temple, "now I have something worth more than land, a future with you." Their journey north took nearly 2 weeks, a cautious path that avoided main roads and larger settlements. Along the way, they spoke of their hopes for the future, a home of their own someday, perhaps children when they were settled. Each night, they grew more comfortable with each other, their physical intimacy developing alongside their emotional reconnection. Isaac was endlessly patient, understanding the scars that Grace's previous marriage had left. His tenderness gradually helped her reclaim parts of herself she'd thought lost forever. As they crossed into Colorado territory, the landscape changed from arid desert to rolling foothills. The familiar terrain brought back memories for both of them, some painful, others sweet with nostalgia. "I never thought I'd see these mountains again," Grace admitted as they rode through a lush valley. "After I married Harold, I convinced myself I'd forgotten what they looked like. It was easier than remembering everything I'd lost." Isaac reached across the space between their horses to squeeze her hand. "You haven't lost them anymore," he said simply. When they finally arrived at the Thompson Horse Ranch outside Denver, Isaac's friend Daniel welcomed them with open arms. True to his word, the job offer still stood a position managing the breeding program with a small cabin on the property for them to live in. "It ain't much," Daniel said as he showed them the cabin, "but it's private and sound. Previous manager left about a month ago, so it's been sitting empty." "It's perfect," Grace declared, already envisioning how to make it their own. That night, as they lay together in their new bed, Grace propped herself up on one elbow to study Isaac's face in the moonlight streaming through the window. "Do you think he'll find us?" she asked, voicing the fear that had shadowed their journey. Isaac considered his answer carefully. Curtis Tanner is a gambling man who throws good money after bad, he said finally. He'll keep looking as long as his pride is hurt, but he won't spend forever chasing across territories. Eventually, he'll find another unfortunate soul to torment. Grace nodded, accepting his assessment. And if he does find us, Isaac's expression hardened. Then I'll protect what's mine. But Grace, he added, his voice softening as he traced the curve of her cheek, don't let fear of him steal any more of your life. We're building something new here, something he can't touch. As summer turned to autumn, they settled into their new life. Isaac excelled at managing the horse breeding program, his natural affinity for the animals earning Daniel's respect and trust. Grace found work in town as a seamstress, her skilled hands creating garments that soon had a waiting list of customers. In October, as the aspen trees turned to gold in the foothills, Grace shared news that changed everything. She was expecting a child in the spring. Isaac's joy knew no bounds, his protective instincts heightening even as his dreams for their future expanded. They celebrated Christmas in their small cabin, a modest affair made special by the love that filled every corner. As they sat before the fire, watching flames dance across the logs, Isaac reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this moment. "What are you thinking about?" Grace asked, catching his thoughtful expression. "That day in Redemption Creek," he replied. "How close I came to not attending that auction, all the circumstances that had to align for us to find each other again." Grace smiled, placing his hand on her growing belly. "Perhaps it wasn't chance at all," she suggested. "Perhaps it was always meant to be." As spring arrived, bringing new life to the Colorado landscape, it also brought their daughter into the world. They named her Hope, a testament to the faith that had sustained them through their darkest times. Standing at the window of their cabin, Isaac held his newborn daughter while watching Grace tend to the small garden they'd planted. The sight filled him with a contentment he'd never thought possible. From the lonely cowboy who'd ridden into Redemption Creek that fateful day to the husband and father, he'd become the transformation seemed nothing short of miraculous. When Grace looked up and caught his gaze, her smile outshone the spring sunshine. In that moment, Isaac knew with absolute certainty that every hardship, every lonely mile, every year of separation had been worth it for the life they'd found together. The sack that had once hidden Grace's face from the world now served a mundane purpose as a storage bag for Hope's tiny outgrown clothes. Like the burlap itself, their painful past had been rewoven into something useful, a foundation of resilience upon which they built their future, one day of love at a time.